we also need to collect computing IDs from those of you who are attending, so we know that you're here, and there's a link to a Google Doc in the chat. If you can take a look at that and give us your computing ID, we can make sure we know who was here. And then the third thing is I'm going to do a poll to just get a sense of how much experience everyone has using GitHub. And I think that'll help us with the presentation. So I'm going to launch that. So if everyone can go ahead and answer as best they can. It's not scientific. We'll get that posted. Give everyone just a couple seconds more to answer. Okay, can everyone see the results? You see that, Jen? Okay, so 30, a decent amount with no experience, a lot with a little bit, and a couple of folks who have a little bit more than that. So that's great. All right, very helpful. Thanks, everyone. Well, the reason we put together this program is primarily because I had been hearing a lot from employers and from alums about how important it is, or how helpful it is really, for students to have some experience with open source projects and a GitHub link that they can include on their resume and share with recruiters when they're going through the interviewing process and the job search process. And I know that a lot of students have experience with it, or you use it some in class with class projects, but I hadn't been seeing very many students who wanted to share their GitHub links on their resume. So we wanted to, our hope is that this session will give you some confidence, maybe a little bit of motivation and some skills to really get started with exploring open source and really managing your GitHub in a way that will allow you to have another resource for learning, but also to give another example of your work to employers when you're going through the job search process. So I'm super excited to have Jed Verity here with us today from GitHub. Jed is a senior engineering manager at GitHub, but before that, he is founded his own company, software engineering consulting company in San Francisco. They had clients that we've all heard of before: Apple, Sundance Film Festival, Pixar. But don't think for a second that Jed is only about technology, because he also has a PhD in Tibetan Buddhism from UVA. He's an accomplished musician. He's a published author. He speaks 5 languages. He has 2 children. So he's been, since the pandemic, also an accidental homeschooler. So that might also explain why he's also a personal productivity expert. So maybe we have to have Jed back another day to help us improve our own personal productivity, which is something I'm sure we all could benefit from these days. But for now, we're super happy to have him talk to us today about GitHub, maybe with a little meditation in there too. But I'll let Jed take it away from here.
Nice. Thank you for that very warm introduction, Dana, which I mostly fed you in the first lesson in appealing to employers is spinning your resume to sound more impressive than it actually is. I do speak 5 languages, but only a few of those I speak really sort of barely conversationally. Anyway, I'm Jed. Very nice to be here with you all today. Takes me back to early days in tech when I had some similar conversations with folks who'd been around the block a few times, and it is my utmost pleasure to be here kind of paying it forward for the people who did it for me. So I'm going to talk, the name of this very short presentation is Engineering Your Life at GitHub. I do believe GitHub is a place where you can launch a tech career. Of course, there are many of other things and skills that you need to develop, but GitHub is just an amazing platform for showing that work, learning, and ultimately presenting yourself to employers and to the tech industry at large. So I do include my email there at the bottom. By all means, feel free to reach out to me after our session here today. I'm happy to advise and otherwise just help however I can. So we'll talk about a few things here today that I hope are helpful, but if there are follow-up subjects that would really be more helpful, I'm happy to continue to engage with all of you. So what I thought I'd do is start and tell you just a little bit more about me and my background, specifically focused on my technical pursuits, less so about Buddhism and music and other things. And then give you a just quick overview of GitHub and how to leverage it, different ways that you may engage with it, especially in, for example, a summer coming up where you may be stuck at home and have some time to do the kind of work that is really valuable there. Plenty of time for questions and answers after that, but let me just dive right into it. So about me, this is a picture of me and my best friend Manish in 9th grade, very excited after winning a ping pong tournament. I include this only to launch into a conversation of how I was never technically inclined growing up. I was never top in my class for computer class, for math, or for anything even obliquely related to technology. But there was a computer in our house in the early days of personal computing, and there were these magical games where you could type like walk onto the spaceship and hit return, and it would type out you are now on the spaceship. And it was just spectacular at the time that this very simplistic text-based game could sort of talk to me like that. So it's kind of hilariously underwhelming now in retrospect, but it just sort of blew my mind. That said, I had no idea that you could ever consider making a career out of anything related to something so fun until I graduated from UVA. I did not do anything with computers or programming, computer science, or anything like that at UVA. I had degrees in, I was a double major in Buddhism and environmental science. But after I landed, after graduation in San Francisco, it was the late 90s, and it was around the time of the first .com boom, which was just an insane and amazing time to be in the city of San Francisco. So it felt at the time like they were just handing jobs out on street corners. And I started first as an intern doing very rote data entry in a software company kind of administrative office. I was literally just copying data from pieces of paper into a database on the computer. But again, things were just so wild in those days, and they were just looking for anybody with an education and with some aptitude. And so I went right from there to being a shipping manager, shipping out boxes of software, which is how software was delivered in those days. It wasn't downloaded over the internet so frequently. Then I moved into technical support, talking to very grumpy customers on the phone, which was a very difficult job. Please be nice to customer support people. It's a thankless job. Then I was the IT manager at this same software company, helping all of our employees get set up with their computers. Those of you who are in computer science or otherwise technically inclined may be doing this for your families already. It felt like very much the same thing, making sure people remembered to actually plug the computer in and turn it on before troubleshooting any further. But then just an insane period of time here in 3 years total, I moved then into a CTO position at that software company. And then I started my own company, the one that Dana referenced. There was just so much work to be done, and everybody needed a website or a web application. And this was the sort of time when software began to eat the world. And just every industry, every company realized that they needed to have a web presence at minimum. and some of them were going to run their entire business online. So it was just a really exciting time to be there. The company that I started was called Data Verse Consulting. It actually originally was Verity Solutions. And it was just me at first, freelancing, helping people with their websites and so forth. But again, there was just so much work to be done and I couldn't do it all on my own. So I just started hiring people that I was meeting out and about in San Francisco and that were freelancers on other jobs. So we quickly found our way into some very rewarding gigs with the likes of Apple, Disney, Pixar, Sundance, a lot of universities and government agencies. And it was just fascinating to see all these different industries, meet all the different people, learn how things work just across all these little demographics and niches of industry. Apart from building for the web, we really didn't have any particular specialty. We just built anything that anybody could dream up until, that is, the year 2014, when things changed substantially for me. And this was the year that I met up with a couple of data scientists. Data science, which some of you may study or know about or have heard of, is a pretty far-reaching, not terribly descriptive term for a bunch of disciplines inside of data science. So sometimes we talk about statistics, sometimes we're talking about machine learning. There are all kinds of different individual pursuits within data science. But these two individuals had been doing the whole kind of suite of things that make up data science in in university and then in professional contexts. And they had this really interesting idea to build tools to make the work of data science easier. And they had this sort of data science background and the ideas, and we had the engineering know-how. So we came together, and at first we just started building this tool to make the work of data science easier. But pretty soon we got connected in to some really interesting projects, most of which were part of a White House data science task force. There was a chief data scientist in the Obama administration who realized that they could save a lot of money and get a lot of results by bypassing the really bureaucratic government contractors and just connect directly with small startups like us. So you can see on the left there an ISIS recruitment video. One of our first projects was to try to figure out where and how ISIS recruitment conversations were happening in social media. So we built all kinds of models and used various tools of data science, disciplines, and engineering to just build applications that would make it easier for researchers to locate not only recruitment conversations in progress, but to build models for being able to predict it and to sort of track it unfolding in real time. The same technology that we developed for that, we also used, as you can see on the right there, to track outbreaks of Ebola and other pandemics around the globe. In our case, we were focused on the Congo, but something that is, of course, very timely right now. We ended up contracting with intelligence agencies, and it was just a crazy and exciting time to be involved in these timely subjects. And in fact, one of the recruiters we identified from ISIS was operating out of San Diego, and about 2 weeks after we submitted his name to some of the agencies we were working with, I read about him being arrested in the paper. I don't know for sure that it was connected to us. There were probably other agencies doing that same kind of work, but it was just crazy to be a part of these efforts. So after a couple of years of doing this kind of work and building these kinds of tools, we got acquired by a satellite company. Satellite companies were very interested in being able to track things like troop movements and ships at sea, and all kinds of different projects using the same kinds of tools that we built. And there was a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence as part of these projects, which were all super exciting too. But after we were acquired, we were there for a couple of years, and things were not going so well for the company as a whole. Didn't particularly enjoy my role there. It felt like a dead end. So I looked for something else and ultimately landed here at GitHub, where I'm a senior engineering manager working on tools that are meant to make the lives of engineers a lot better, make the work of software development a lot more transparent and fun and educational. So the moral of my story that I would like to share, would love for you to take away, is that it doesn't really matter where you start, where you rank in your class, what kind of job you get at first. Again, my first job out of college, which by the way, I thought I was way overqualified for, was a data entry specialist, something that I felt like, you know, a monkey could do. And yet, you know, it led over the course of 3 years into an executive position, and ultimately to me finding my own company. So no matter where you start, no matter where you land, there is a place for you in the tech industry, and there will be opportunities to grow and advance and do extremely exciting and lucrative work if you're just willing to put in the work. So, and one little bit, sort of last bit to that too, moral story, it helps a lot in this day and age to know some data science. So if you haven't pursued any data science classes, there is this spectacular Data Science Institute at UVA, soon to be a school of data science. You are positioned, I would think, better than a lot of people entering the workforce to actually kind of bone up on some of those skills before you actually get out there. It's very timely, very exciting area. Okay, so where to actually start now with GitHub, pivoting over into GitHub specific subject area. First of all, I'd like to share this story that Linus Torvalds, founder of Linux, was quoted as saying at a conference that he was speaking at, which is that, you know, I don't know if you've been exposed to this, if you've been out in Silicon Valley for a while or reading the stories about founders and innovation and stuff, there's so much hemming and hawing and ideating and talking about innovation and entrepreneurship and so forth. And though he's a little bit more blunt than I tend to be, I thought there was an important message in here, which is that especially when you're first starting out, just sitting down and writing some code, doing the work, is about as good advice as I can recommend. Some of you may feel, depending on your level, some anxiety about where to start, or about other people seeing your work at a really early stage. And I'm here to tell you that there are just millions of us that have been in that situation and who are in that situation. And the ones who are succeeding are the ones who are just sitting down and saying, I'm going to give it a try. One of our core values here at GitHub is called Ship to Learn. And the idea is that you can do some reading, you can do some studying, all that's very important. Some of the most important learning you will have is when you're actually in the middle of building something, or of just trying to get something down in a repository in GitHub, you know, a code repo. Another one of our values is growth mindset, which means don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to fail. Those are the core learning moments. We've tried to institutionalize that here at GitHub to say, we know everybody's going to screw up, quote unquote screw up. Those screw ups are actually when we grow and when we learn the better way. So do not be afraid of that. So just start coding is one of the messages I want to leave for you today. You make mistakes, you're going to learn a ton. Okay, but how to get started coding? Again, some of you probably don't have that question at all. Others of you may. I'm going to talk about this in the context of GitHub. And the way I'd like to do that is to tell the story of Winnie Palangpour. She was a receptionist at a research lab in Austin, Texas. And she had the idea one day that this was not a very good job and she was not very engaged. And so she wanted to see what coding and web development was all about. So she followed a tutorial for creating a simple web-based tic-tac-toe app. And you can see that there in the sort of top left of these boxes, her code repositories. So she followed that tutorial, and the tutorial suggested creating a GitHub account. So she did that mostly as a way for her to just stash her code somewhere online, right? Like you can code on your own computers and that is a crucial part of the process. But being able to have it somewhere where you know, your computer crashes, or you want to show it to somebody, or you want to collaborate with somebody, GitHub was made just for that. So she did this tutorial. She stashed her code up there in GitHub. And when our company, the one that was tracking the ISIS recruitment, was looking for a web developer, somebody had found her page, I think through like a friend of a friend of a friend, and found this profile here on GitHub and sent it to me. And I looked through, I had never talked to her. I looked through her initial tic-tac-toe repository here, the code that she had written as part of this tutorial. And it seemed like she, you know, it was the first thing she'd ever written, and it was mostly following a tutorial. And yet the fact that she had the guts to put it up there, and you know, you can see in her description here, one of my first apps, yay, it just sort of felt like there was an obvious kind of exuberance there. And I was just kind of interested to see what she could do without an explicit tutorial, and instead just sort of take it from here. So I asked her to create what you can see just to the right there, the React tic-tac-toe. I said, take your tic-tac-toe app that you created the tutorial and rewrite in React, which is a library that is used in JavaScript to help create interfaces, web pages like you see here, web applications. So she took it on eagerly, she did great, and we hired her. And the total amount of investment in there, you know, was probably like a few weeks at most from her side. And just to sort of play her story out there, we hired her. Her first job as an engineer was for this startup that ended up getting acquired by a Digital Globe, as I'd said, the satellite company, which is really exciting. About the time that I left, she also left to be a co-founder of another startup. And that startup is looking like it's about to be acquired by a very large social media company that we've all heard of. So her trajectory has just been amazing. And it started with this feeling of like, I'm not happy being a receptionist. Maybe I'll just start coding and put it up on GitHub and see what happens. So not all stories are like this one, of course. There's a lot of being in the right place at the right time. And she knew people who knew people that knew me and our company. And that made a big difference. But it all started out with this simple tutorial on GitHub. And now, you know, one thing I would really point out also is that I guarantee, so this, if I were to actually, this is just a screenshot, but if I were to click into that repo, you'd see that that's 5 years old. And I guarantee that you'd be amazed, she probably is amazed to look back now, some 5 years later. She has just exploded as an engineer. And every single person I know, every engineer I know, including myself, looks back at old code, like even from 6 months ago, and can't believe we wrote what we did in the way that we did. This is the story of every engineer ever. It's again, just encouragement to not be worried about what you put up there, because every single one of us looks back and says, you know, what was I thinking? I know so much more now than I did then. So what I wanted to do at this point, for those of you who are not so familiar with GitHub, is just to give you a really quick glimpse at how easy it is to get started. I know there were some questions about like, well, when I go to existing repositories, there's just so much there, and it's kind of overwhelming. And so I'm going to talk about open source and getting involved in that with existing repos. But to just kind of close out like Whitney's story and this first way of engaging with GitHub, to just put your own code up there, I just wanted to give you a quick demo for that. You can see my profile screen here. Is that right, Dana? You can see my smiling picture there. Okay, so basically I just went up here to this new repository button, and that takes you to this screen where you can, so I didn't include the demo of setting up your own account. That's something that GitHub is very good at walking you through if you don't already have one. But again, you can email me if you do have any troubles with that, but I don't think you will. But anyway, so you're creating a new repository, and I'm going to just create one called demo. You can say, this is for a talk, like that you saw in Winnie's, where she was like, this is one of my first apps, yay. Public or private. Now, here's a case where GitHub has private repos where you don't have to show it to anybody. You keep it just for you. I generally recommend that you keep it public. It's in the spirit of open source. And again, it enables you to share it with people, for employers to see. And even if it's your early stage kind of first repo and you're worried about it, they'll still like to see it. They'll totally understand where you are. So there's this option to initialize with the README, but I'm going to skip that for now, because when you go ahead and create repository, it tells you how to, every step you need to actually get started pushing code into this repo. So I'm going to just do a quick, I'm going to bypass this just really quickly to be able to show you what's happening here. You won't be able to see my screen, but I'm just following these instructions, copying them out and pasting them in to a shell. I'm using iterm2 on a Mac, but there are lots of shell applications on Mac, Windows, Linux. I'm assuming a number, if not most of you, are already pretty familiar with that. But I'm going to push my code up. Literally just copied and pasted every one of these instructions. And if I refresh my page, you can see that the README that they had me create, had these tests in this same file, is now what you see on this page. And so from here on out, you will be able to create files either directly in the repo itself. So if I'm creating a JavaScript file, I might just say hello world in here and commit it. And I'm going to talk about documentation in a minute, like commit comments and so forth. But for now, I'm just going to keep that sort of by default. And now you can see I created that file in there, and I can view it, I can edit it, and you have this whole editing interface, but you also have your shell where I copied and pasted those initial instructions, and you can use that push command to get it up here into this repo. So I have some resources for you that I'll link to, and make sure you have these links that will help you to get more familiar with Git. This Git handbook link in the guides site is really helpful for orienting to Git and how it interfaces with GitHub. This is just great starter guide. And then I also included like some links for a typical tutorial that you could follow along, much in the way that Winnie did, to just really get started. Okay, so that's super simple version of getting started with putting your own code up in GitHub. I'd like to shift gears now to the other way that you can engage with GitHub, which is to contribute to another project. And this can be a little bit difficult to get started with when you haven't done much in the way of creating your own applications and code, but it's absolutely worth giving it a shot and just starting to learn how it works. So the open source movement, which many of you are probably familiar with, started on the premise that we should be able to create and share code out, libraries and whole applications and snippets of code with licenses that let anybody use them for their own projects. So rather than the kind of 90s and early 2000s model of like all code is siloed inside organizations that then own it and nobody else has access to it, and in the process, every engineer at every company is reinventing the wheel, this movement came along and said, there are plenty of ways to develop proprietary applications that you then can sell, but leveraging the whole community, the work of the whole community, effectively for free, to then not have to reinvent the wheel for some basic functionality that is common to so many different applications. So there are just a huge number of projects now that offer libraries, tools, applications at all different levels. And I should say that while it's open source in the sense that in most cases it's free to use, you can see here in the case of one famous open source maintainer and contributor, Henry, there's a sponsor button, which is a feature that GitHub has come out with in the last year to allow companies and individuals to directly sponsor open source maintainers and contributors. And so a number of these open source contributors do have other jobs, but Henry is an example of somebody who only does open source and gets paid for it. So this is another place where you can not only build out a kind of resume and knowledge, but look towards getting some income. That usually doesn't happen until you're a little bit further down the road, but it is possible. So open source is a little bit intimidating to get started with because it can be difficult to know where to start. There are so many engineers involved. Again, as somebody's question said, it's hard sometimes just to even make sense of where to start. But I want to address a misconception about open source, which is that it's somehow all very high level, very sophisticated, very high quality code with only like very senior experienced engineers. The fact of the matter is that open source is an incredibly diverse patchwork of different engineers with different skills and experiences. One of the most widely used open source libraries, which is a collection of JavaScript tools, under the covers is obviously the result of many engineers of different levels over many years, and you can see the layers of kind of sedimented code in there. And it is not this kind of beautiful monolithic piece of artistry. It is a messy patchwork that a bunch of developers are doing a good job wrangling. So I want to encourage you very strongly to not be intimidated or to think that you are too inexperienced to get involved. It'll take a little time to get oriented, but there are tons of people like you who are getting engaged. So there are a bunch of different ways to actually get involved, but I want to share this particular couple of resources. I'll also make sure you all have the links to this. And these two links are just a great place to get started as you think about what does it even mean to engage with an open source project. Lots of good details here, reasons why to do it, ways to get involved, and I strongly encourage you to read this sort of top to bottom and get a sense of how you can get started. So one important point I wanted to bring out here is that one of the first ways to get involved is not even to contribute code. Some projects desperately need a little bit better clarity and documentation, or they need like a resources section, somebody to help do some research for them that then they can bring back and post as links in documentation. And these can be just great ways to start getting into the conversation without feeling like you need to understand the whole code base in order to do anything. And then finally, another really, really useful collection of links here is this awesome for beginners repository. And here you can see somebody using GitHub only for documentation. You can kind of ignore this .github repo for directory for now and just focus on the fact that somebody just created a repository on GitHub to post this collection of links with some context to help other engineers navigate GitHub. And so what you'll see in here are a list of languages that link out to projects that are good for beginners, that often have some issues with a label called good first issue. You'll see this good first issue label. And when you go into these projects, you'll see that there are these labels that you can then click on to just view only the issues that have that have been identified as a good place to start. And so some of these will be easier to understand than others, but if you already have a language that you're familiar with, this can be a great way to make inroads into open source. Sorry, let me see here. Okay, yeah. So one of the reasons that it can be good to do a few of the reasons why it can be good to engage with open source as opposed to or in addition to starting up your own project on GitHub is, first of all, there can be an already established project. You don't have to think up what to do as a whole new project or go through the tutorials if you feel like you're not interested in learning through that medium at the moment. Here are these kind of already up and running libraries that you can start to explore and kind of piggyback on people's ideas. The other kind of critical element of this is the social dimension. This, on the one hand, enables people to help you so that if you were to go in there, find your way into a good first issue, or even just identify as you're reading the documentation for a project that it could be clearer and you want to submit a pull request, which is the way to actually suggest a change that then the maintainers can choose to merge in or not. People will start to get in conversation with you. And for the most part, open source is a very friendly place. There are some exceptions where people get really passionate, but for the most part, people are going to be really willing to help. And if you go in and say, I'd really like to help with this issue, I'm not 100% sure where to start, or what do you think about this? People will generally be very helpful. So it's a nice way to get help. But the other side of it is that eventually employers are going to look at your work here, and not just your work, but the way that you're interacting with folks. So the nature of those interactions, are you a nice person? Are you comfortable saying you don't know? Are you comfortable trying to also help other people if you feel like you can? Showing those social interactions is in some ways even more important to employers than like what the quality of your code looks like. And in fact, I would suggest if employer cares more about the quality of your code than they do about how effectively you can communicate and engage with other people in the community, they may or may not be the right place for you. That's my personal opinion. But then it's just also super cool that if you make a contribution, even at the level of documentation, tons of people potentially, depending on how big the project is. You can see this Babel project on Henry's page has 36,000 stars, which probably means something like actually many millions of people are using it. It says many people have favorited it. That your contribution is going to be viewed and used by, hundreds, thousands, potentially millions of people, which is pretty amazing. So I'm going to skip this because I talked about good first issues, and here I'm just going to sum up. So to have some takeaways from this brief presentation here, ship to learn, don't be afraid to make mistakes, just get started. Post your code in a public repo in your GitHub account. You can follow a tutorial. There are tons of them out there, like this beginner's guide that I posted, but there are just tons. You pick a language or a subject, or find a site and just pick through the different tutorials. There are tons. Or if you have thoughts already of stuff you want to write, little toy projects, just go ahead and post them from scratch. Finally, contribute. Learn from others in open source. Show employers that you're a good citizen in the industry. There's just so much to learn there, and give yourself some time to really explore it, because it's a learning curve. There's no doubt about it. It'll take some time. A few tips. Document your work really well. As I just said, employers care as much or more about communication as they do about the quality of your code. And so adding a README, as the GitHub repo tips suggested you do, and as I did, is really useful, just as a place to say, here's what I'm doing and why. Here are challenges I'm working on. If you expect other people to look at it, just use it as an opportunity to have a little conversation with them and let them know what they should be looking at, or acknowledge some things that you're working on. And then take this all the way, document, make sure to bring that documentation and communication agenda all the way into your code. So Lots of code commenting is good. Writing really descriptive commit messages. Those of you who haven't used Git much, a commit is the way that you say, okay, I'm ready to call this bit of code done. And so I'm going to commit it and start working on something else. It also lets you undo that later if you need to. So just being really descriptive and clear and assuming that it's going to be hard for people to understand what you're doing, because it is, right? And reading other people's code can be quite challenging. Do not be afraid to ask for help. Stack Overflow is a great site that some of you have surely found to ask questions. When you have your code up in GitHub, you can share a link to it in Stack Overflow and say, I'm trying to do this, or a tutorial is telling me to do this, but it's not working. Can somebody help me here? And Stack Overflow is just a really great site and community for helping you along. And then finally, another imploring to be nice. There are just plenty of people in the industry as a whole who are not so nice. The nice ones are the ones that get hired. Here are the references that I mentioned in the course of the talk here. Again, I'll just make sure that you all have access to this and you can explore from there. I know that was a lot of information pretty quickly. I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to make sure to leave some time here for questions or going any further into particular subject that I may have glossed over. Anything that would be useful to anybody.
And I'm going to add, if you want to just unmute yourself and ask Jed your question live, or you can also put it in the chat if you'd rather do that. And I'll start off with a question that I got earlier, Jed, just someone talking about the tons of different types of files in a repository. And is there anything specific you can say around what the traditional structure of the repositories is?
So, you know, every technology, every language, every framework, library, and so forth is likely to have some convention for creating and organizing files for the project. And you will definitely come across some repos where it is just total chaos, right? Like that's just a reality for some projects, whether it's an actual open source library that's being used or it's just somebody's personal project. And I would highly recommend if you land on a repository that is just total confusion and there's no documentation that tells you, that explains how it's organized, move on to the next one. There's, really trying to make sense of what's going on in there. If there isn't much help or you don't have the context for it, could end up just being a waste of time unless you have another reason to really be invested in that project. So that awesome beginners list includes a number of projects that do not have that problem. They're simpler to understand, or there's good documentation that helps to orient you.
All right. Any other questions? We'll give everyone a minute or a few seconds to type or to think or.
It's practice we got at GitHub that you gotta have at least like 20 seconds of silence before people will come out.
So just while people are thinking, we're recording this, so we'll post it, we'll send it out either in our newsletter that we send out on Tuesdays or post it to our CoLab site, or that's probably the two most likely places that we'll post it, but it will be available afterward. And we'll get the links from the presentation, the resources to send out as well. So we have a question from Chloe. Can you explain again what React.js is?
Yeah. So there is, in web technologies, there is a typical collection of languages to produce web pages. And again, forgive me for people who know all this already, but typically what you have is HTML, that is the markup and the code that actually creates the elements on the page. So in like a form, you have a form element and input elements where you type in the text, and for banners and so forth, the HTML lets you create those shapes and inputs and so forth. And then you have CSS, cascading style sheets, which is responsible for the presentation, the styling of things that you're seeing. So the colors and the sizes sometimes, and the positions on the page and all of that. And then you have JavaScript, which introduces a dynamic component to the page, so that, like if you click a checkbox and something appears and then disappears when you unclick the checkbox, or you click on a link and without the page even fully reloading, you see some new content on it. It's JavaScript that in most cases is giving you the ability for that dynamic content. And as you start to build out really rich applications like a Facebook or a Twitter or something like that, it starts to get very complex, managing all of the different interactions that are happening dynamically on your page. And so React is a library that Facebook created to make it much easier to build pages that have all of those elements. It has HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but it also gives you tools to make it much easier to manage more complex applications. And so it lets you, it has a place where you say, here's what I want my HTML to look like, and here's what I want my interactions to look like. And it's much more structured and clean and frankly fun than trying to do all of that work just with the raw languages themselves. So if you're interested in web development, you wouldn't use React just for like a very simple little web page, but it's worth exploring it for something simple if you just want to learn it. But the use case for it professionally is when you start to have more complex applications that have a lot of interactions in them. Was that enough for you, Chloe, or did you want me to go more detail to some of that? All right. Happy to answer any follow-up questions by email, whatever, let me know.
And then we have another question about, do you recommend beginners start out using GitHub's web interface or Git to interact with and maintain repositories?
So the web interface is a nice way just to have a little bit less intimidating experience for just understanding GitHub itself. But as you start to build as you start to do real coding and building a project, you will definitely want to use the shell interface with Git, because at least right now we're working on some features in this domain, but at least for now, there's no way to really execute the code inside of GitHub, at least not in a way that's really productive and easy. And so that means that as you're starting to actually try to build a program, using only the web interface will not let you, actually execute and see if you're building it correctly, or see what the log is from that. Like I just did that console log hello world. I happen to know that that's going to work, but GitHub gave me no information one way or the other, right? It just let me put it there. So my general rule of thumb is to do it through the shell, build your code, follow those first steps to link your local directory on your computer with your GitHub repo, and then just keep committing and pushing it up from there. And then you can use the web interface for like, oh, I misspelled this in my documentation, or I want to, experiment a little bit organizationally.
Awesome. So we had a question, is it common practice to link GitHubs on resumes?
Absolutely, yes. I can almost guarantee, not 100%, every company is different, but I can almost guarantee that if you don't include it, people are going to go looking for it. If you have a common name, you could end up somebody getting a picture of you that is not actually you. And by picture, I mean a picture of your coding life, not your actual picture, although that too. So highly recommend including your profile. Like you saw me starting out when I did the demo, that was my profile page. And doing that is really helpful for companies. It also suggests you're not afraid to have them come and see whatever you have there, which is something that people are looking for. Like if you don't include it, they're going to wonder why. So common practice and a good practice. Yes.
Totally agree with that. All right, another question. I've read that a good way to become involved in an open source project is to jump straight into looking through its code base. Do you recommend that? And if you do, how should we approach it?
So I 100% support that if you're already somewhat fluent with the code, with the language of the code base. I think, trying to learn a language and a project is going to be very frustrating. But if you already know the language pretty well, then 100% support that. And in fact, as you progress as an engineer, it's increasingly likely that you will find the information you need more often in the code base than in the documentation, if only because we engineers tend to be not so good at documentation. So it's a great practice. It's a great way to learn things. And again, you can use that as a launching point, either into Stack Overflow or in the repository itself to say, I'm trying to understand this. I saw this. It doesn't make much sense to me. Can anybody help? And so it's a good way to spin up for sure.
All right, another question. Do you think it's silly / immature to learn and use an overkill technology like React for something simple like a personal project website?
So absolutely not silly or immature if you are doing so for learning purposes, right? Like basically every website that I have built that is a pretty simple kind of billboard information only website, including the one that I snapshotted for my company, Dataverse Consulting. I took that need as an opportunity to explore a new technology that I wasn't yet familiar with. So the tech that's behind that little company website is ridiculously complex and overkill because I was just wanting an excuse to learn it. So I wouldn't recommend it. Like, as you start to professionalize, I wouldn't go in there and somebody's like, oh, I just want to put up, our name and phone number. And you'll be like, I recommend React for that. So I wouldn't do that, but for your own purposes, it's a great idea. I strongly support that.
Can I ask a question through the mic?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with GitHub and I actually have like a project up there, but this is a question catered to more like intermediate people that understand it. But from your perspective or from a recruiter's perspective, what should people that already have projects do to take it like a step up or like to stand out from other people with projects that exist?
Yeah, so I think, again, this is a place where I would come back to the emphasis on communication. You can, if you feel so inclined, return to existing projects to, refactor according to your latest and greatest sensibilities about how to write code and so forth. That's okay if you want to do that. There's some cases where, like, if you are applying for a job that is focused very much on the technology of a project that you already have, that may be a case where you want to actually refactor to show your latest abilities. But for the most part, I think the thing that really distinguishes repositories and engineers from others is the communication. So there are just so many repos out there that, even people who are really well versed in the code can't make sense of, because there's been no effort whatsoever put into communication or presentation. And that's fine. Like there's, when you're just stashing your code up as a project and you don't even understand enough to really document everything yet, that's totally fine. That's normal. But as you start to share things with employers, I think it's a really good practice to go back and at least in your README to talk about what the context was for this project, challenges you were trying to tackle, things you learned from it, any disclaimers that you want to put in there of like, I wrote this a number of years ago, and now I'm working more on projects of a different caliber or different kind. So just giving somebody a little roadmap to that repository in your README is definitely unusual. And I, as somebody who's hired a lot of folks over the years, something like that just, it makes me so happy. So that could be a good way to distinguish yourself.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have, well, we're about at time, but I wanted to ask you one other question, Jed, that we got from a student beforehand, and it's probably a little more technical than some of the other questions, but the question is, what's the best way to squash previous commits into one?
So that, there is a whole kind of squash workflow in Git, and the GitHub guides, let me see if that includes at least a link out there. I tell you what I'll do. I will, if it's not in that GitHub guide, I'll review that, but I will show, link out from there. If it doesn't include it, I'll link out some more kind of higher level Git tutorials that'll really help with those kinds of things. Because of course, Git is amazing, invented by the same guy who I just quoted, saying just, stop talking and get to work. And so there's tremendous diversity of things that you can do. It's very powerful. So I'll include that in resources if it's not already there.
Anyone else? You could put it in the chat or just unmute yourself if you want to ask out loud. That's fine too. I'm going to put the link again in the chat where we're collecting contact info or just computing IDs from everyone so we know who was here today. If you haven't given us that, that would be great to have. All right. I think that might be all of our questions.
Okay, well, pleasure being here today. Again, please email me if you'd like, or reach out to Dana, who can get in touch with me if you need. Very exciting to see you all showing up for a talk like this today. I hope it will inspire you or give you some skills to do some great things this summer and beyond. So thanks everybody for coming.
Yes, thank you so much, Jed, for being here. We really appreciate you taking your time today also. So it's I think, so inspiring to have alums that can come back and provide such great advice and guidance to our students. And we really, really appreciate the time and effort.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for organizing, Dana.
Sure.
Look forward to catching up again soon.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.